A report produced for the Department for Levelling Up by Dame Sarah Khan came back today with, I think, some quite disturbing conclusions. 75% of us are scared to speak our minds for fear that somebody may be offended. Worse still, behaviour that is extremist behaviour often simply doesn't get called out because people fear reprisals. Now, perhaps none of this stuff is a great surprise to you, but it still says an awful lot about the kind of country we've become over the course of the last couple of decades. I remember being told as a kid, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Well, goodness gracious me, we've moved a very long way from that. I'm joined by Luke Tryl, UK Director of More in Common. Luke, was there anything in this report that shocked you and surprised you, or was it kind of what you expected to hear?
Well, unfortunately, actually, lots of it wasn't shocking to us at More in Common, because, we spend a lot of time talking to people around the country who've experienced some of the things which were detailed in this report.
Yeah, freedom-restricting harassment was the phrase that kept coming up.
Yeah, so this is a really important term that Sarah Khan coined in this report. And this was the sense that there is this new development of freedom-restricting harassment, which is basically when people use intimidation, when they use abuse, or when they use threats to basically force people to censor or self-censor themselves. And that can range from, she talks in the report about doxing, about death threats, about rape threats. And I think there's a bit of a misunderstanding, which Sarah busts in this report, that this only happens online. And no, she details examples of where it happens in person. And it doesn't just happen to elected representatives. We know MPs face threats. Yeah. We've seen it recently over the conflict in Gaza. But actually, it's a whole range of different groups who are experiencing this. It's academics, it's artists, it's teachers, in the case of the Batley Grammar School, which Sarah details in the report. So it's a really worrying thing. And, she did some polling as part of this report and found that 76% of people were restricting basically what they said for fear of being abused.
Is this the logical conclusion of hate speech laws? Because under hate speech laws, it's hate speech if the person or group you're talking about themselves feel offended. Are we heading down a path as a result of well-intended, I've no doubt, well-intended legislation that is basically shrivelling free speech?
I actually think this is coming from the other end. I think this is, and what Sarah details in the report, is where organisations like local authorities, sometimes the police, sometimes schools themselves, think that the best thing to do is to appease those who have the most extreme views.
Or the loudest voices.
To quieten them down. And then that sort of moderate majority ends up being the people who suffer and being restricted, because it's those with the loudest views. I used to work in education for Ofsted. I was a special advisor in the Department for Education. And what I saw there, there were those protests in Birmingham outside schools for their sex education content. And what you got was people who weren't parents of the school were coming in, were hijacking these protests, and were abusing teachers for, just doing their job and teaching. And one of the recommendations Sarah makes is that perhaps we need a buffer zone now outside of schools to protect 150 metres. Not for industrial action, so not strikes, but for things like we saw in Birmingham, to make sure that teachers aren't facing that abuse, just going into school and doing their job.
So is the big fault line here religion?
It's one of the big fault lines, certainly. Lots of the examples which Sarah documents are religious, but there are also examples of, far-right activity, but also debates, for instance, around trans and gender-critical conflicts there as well. There's a huge range. There's even one example where she talks, and I know this will be particularly disturbing to you, comedians who have sympathy for Brexit, not being willing to express their views because they think they'll be ostracised. And look, the truth is, we all self-censor a little bit because, British people are decent, we don't want to be rude.
We self-censor to the point that certainly we don't want to incite.
Yeah.
And we want to make our point without... Yeah, we don't generally want to willfully offend.
Exactly that. And that, is healthy, because, if we all just said what we thought all the time, the bad thing, what this report is talking about is something deeper than that. It's where people are afraid of expressing their beliefs because they're worried about the consequences. And some of that might be sort of policing of language, but a lot of it, and the body of the report, is actually about people facing threats from extremist groups.